It's easy if you try.
3 nights before Glenn Hughes told the world he was stepping away from live performance, he was still on stage. That is the detail that changes everything. On Saturday, August 4th, 2026, Glenn appeared with Kings of Chaos at the Agua Caliente Casino in Rancho Mirage, California. Richie Sambora was there. So were Matt Sorum, Steve Stevens, Kevin Cronin, Jack Blades, and other musicians who had spent their lives in front of large audiences. To the people watching, it was another all-star rock show. Loud guitars, familiar songs, men who had survived several eras of the business and were still standing beneath the lights. No public farewell had been announced. There was no sign telling the audience that Glenn might never do this again. Then, on August 4th, a message appeared on his official website. The heading was simple: Live Shows Cancelled. Glenn Hughes, the former Deep Purple singer and bassist, known for decades as the voice of rock, was retiring from touring and live performances. His doctors had advised him to undergo heart surgery, and he would be stepping away from the stage for what the announcement called the foreseeable future. Glenn explained that he had experienced health problems during the previous year. A series of MRIs, CT scans, and an echocardiogram had given his medical team enough concern to recommend another open-heart operation. Then came the sentence that made the announcement feel more final than anyone expected. I really have no option and no choice. He did not say he was dying. He did not say he would never make music again. He did not describe the precise condition found during those examinations, and it would be wrong to invent one. But he did say his health had become the priority. And after more than 5 decades of performing, every remaining live commitment was removed. For fans who saw Glenn in California only days earlier, the news must have been difficult to place beside what they remembered. They had watched him perform without knowing that the evening might later be described as his final show. Perhaps Glenn did not know either. That is what makes the timing so unsettling. Earlier reports had pointed to May 30th at the Arcada Theater in St. Charles, Illinois, where Glenn reunited with the Dead Daisies for a special one-night performance. He sang and played bass through 2 sets, songs from the Dead Daisies, followed by Deep Purple classics including Burn, Mistreated, and Highway Star. The event had been promoted as a rare night with no repeat date. For a brief time, it looked as though that Illinois concert might have been his last. Then the California appearance emerged. So the final public image is not yet a quiet theater in May. It is Glenn on stage at the beginning of August, surrounded by musicians, only days before admitting that doctors had found something serious enough to stop the live part of his life. There had been an earlier warning. Back on January 9th, Glenn canceled his planned 2026 tour because of what was described publicly as a minor health issue. At the time, the language sounded cautious and temporary. The problem needed attention over the coming months, but there was still hope of returning to the road. 7 months later, the word minor was gone. In its place were medical scans, another open-heart surgery, and a decision Glenn said he could no longer avoid. For anyone who remembers the first time that voice came through the speakers on a Deep Purple record, this is not simply news about canceled concerts. It raises a harder question. Did Glenn Hughes already sing his last song on stage without anyone in the room realizing they were hearing goodbye? In January 2026, the announcement did not sound like the end of anything. It sounded temporary. Glenn Hughes had planned a 6-week American tour for the spring, beginning in California on March 27th and continuing through May. The show was called The Chosen Years, built around music from Trapeze, Deep Purple, Hughes' Thrall, Black Country Communion, and his solo career. He had even described it as a 2-hour journey through 5 decades of music. Then, on January 9th, the entire tour was canceled. The explanation was only a few lines long. Glenn had what was described as a minor health issue that required attention over the coming months. He said he was following the advice of his medical team and ended his message with a hopeful phrase, "Hoping to see you on the road of happy destiny." There was no mention of heart surgery, no suggestion that he was leaving live performance. Nothing in that first statement indicated that fans might already have seen the beginning of his final year on stage. And perhaps, at the time, Glenn did not know that either. That is one of the details we have to be careful with. The recent announcement does not explain exactly what doctors knew in January. It does not say whether surgery was already being considered or whether the more serious findings came later. All we know is that Glenn spent the following months undergoing medical evaluation. According to his new statement, those examinations included MRIs, CT scans, and an echocardiogram. By August, his medical team had reached a much more serious conclusion. He needed another open-heart operation. The word minor was no longer being used. It is easy to look backward now and treat the January cancellation as an obvious warning. But that is not how fans received it at the time. A touring musician in his 70s canceling dates because of a health issue is concerning, but it is not unusual. Rest for a few months. Complete the treatment. Return when the doctors give permission. That seemed to be the expectation. In fact, the possibility of performing again remained alive publicly. On July 10th, Glenn's official website announced a special show with the Daisies for October 2nd at the Canyon Club in Agoura Hills, California. The plan was for 2 sets, one built around the Daisies and another around Deep Purple material. So even after the spring tour had been canceled, there was still a date ahead, a return, one more night. Then came the new announcement, and that October concert disappeared with every other live commitment. For older fans, this may feel familiar in an uncomfortable way. You are first told something is manageable. Months pass, more tests are ordered. The language becomes more careful. Then the explanation changes, not because anyone necessarily misled you, but because medicine sometimes reveals the full problem slowly. A scan shows one thing, another test raises a different concern. Eventually, the conversation is no longer about when the tour can resume. It is about whether touring should continue at all. Glenn has not publicly identified the exact heart condition behind the new operation. He has not described the date of the procedure, the hospital, or what recovery may involve. Those details remain private. What he did reveal was the decision. He was retiring from touring and live performance for the foreseeable future. Not from songwriting, not necessarily from recording, not from music itself, from the road. That distinction matters because Glenn's entire adult life had been shaped by movement. A new city, a sound check, a hotel, another stage. Even after the January cancellation, there was still an assumption that the road might reopen. Now he was saying he had no choice. And before we understand why another heart operation carries so much weight, we have to go back to the first time doctors opened Glenn Hughes's chest and the life he fought to return to afterward. The words "another open heart operation" carry a history Glenn Hughes understands better than most of his fans. He has been here before. In 2013, Glenn underwent surgery to repair an enlarged aorta. The condition had been discovered before it caused the kind of emergency that might have ended very differently. But that did not make the operation small. Doctors had to open his chest and repair a major blood vessel carrying blood away from the heart. Glenn later spoke openly about the experience, saying he believed God had watched over him through the procedure and recovery. He returned to music afterward. That is probably why some fans will look at the new announcement and expect the same result. Glenn survived one major heart operation, recovered, and eventually went back to recording and touring. Perhaps he will do it again. Perhaps. But he was in his early 60s then. He is 74 now, and the language surrounding this operation is different. This time, Glenn has not announced a temporary break followed by a planned return date. He has retired from touring and live performance for the foreseeable future. His doctors have advised surgery, and he has said he has no real alternative. To understand why leaving the stage means so much, you have to remember what Glenn brought to it. He did not sound like the typical British hard rock singer of the early 1970s. Long before Deep Purple called, he had developed his voice with trapeze, drawing as much from American soul and funk as from heavy guitar music. When he joined Deep Purple in 1973, the band was already going through a dangerous transition. Ian Gillan and Roger Glover had left. David Coverdale arrived as the new lead singer, while Glenn took over bass and shared the vocals. That combination could easily have failed. Instead, the new lineup recorded Burn, released in 1974. Glenn's high, soulful voice did not compete with Coverdale's deeper tone. It gave the songs another edge entirely. You could hear hard rock, blues, gospel, and something closer to Motown passing through the same performance. Then came Stormbringer later that year, followed by Come Taste the Band in 1975. Glenn helped pull Deep Purple toward a stronger mixture of rock, soul, and funk, even when that direction created tension inside the group. Older fans remember more than album titles. They remember the first seconds of Burn before there was any time to prepare for what followed. They remember Mistreated, stretching across concert halls. They remember Glenn standing with a bass strapped across him, reaching notes that seemed almost too high and too raw to come from the same man holding down the rhythm. That voice became the constant. Bands changed. Partnerships ended. Years disappeared into addiction. Musical fashions moved on. Glenn's voice remained recognizable. In 2016, Deep Purple was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, with Glenn included among the honored members. It formally placed his years with the band inside rock history, but his fans had made that judgment decades earlier. The title, Voice of Rock, can sound like promotion until you hear him live. Then, it makes sense. Glenn did not preserve that voice by living carefully from the beginning. His survival was much messier than that. There were years when the greatest threat to his future was not a medical scan or a damaged aorta. It was Glenn himself, and before his heart forced him into surgery for the first time, addiction had already brought him close to losing the career and the life he would later fight so hard to rebuild. Long before doctors told Glenn Hughes that his heart needed another operation, there was a period when almost no one expected him to reach old age. Glenn has never tried to soften that part of his life. The drug use began during the Deep Purple years, when success came quickly and almost everything around the band encouraged excess. Cocaine was easy to find. Money was no longer a limitation. Hotels, recording sessions, and long nights began to blur together. At first, it probably looked like part of the job. That was the culture around many major rock bands in the 1970s. People worked hard, traveled constantly, and treated the damage as something to deal with later. The trouble was that later arrived differently for everyone. For Glenn, the habit remained after Deep Purple ended in 1976. The band was gone, but the cocaine was not. His career continued in pieces. There was a solo album, sessions with other musicians, and later, work connected to Tony Iommi and Black Sabbath. Yet the person arriving at those opportunities was becoming less reliable. Glenn has said that the addiction moved beyond cocaine into freebasing and crack. His official autobiography describes cocaine psychosis, crack dependency, and what its publisher calls a clean-up or die crisis. That phrase sounds dramatic until you hear Glenn describe the fear himself. He later recalled knowing that the next hit of crack might be the last one. He experienced paranoia and moments when he believed he was approaching the end. Yet even frightening incidents did not immediately make him stop. Addiction rarely responds to one warning in the way people imagine it should. Friends and family tried to reach him. According to Glenn, people who loved him repeatedly told him to get himself together. He understood their words, but understanding was not the same as being ready. Years later, he explained the turning point in very ordinary language. He became tired of waking up sick and tired. There was also an unexpected musical doorway. In the early 1990s, Glenn recorded vocals for the KLF's America, What Time Is Love? It was an unusual collaboration for someone associated with Deep Purple and hard rock, but Glenn later said the experience helped lead him toward rehabilitation. Working with Bill Drummond and Jimmy Cauty gave him a chance to hear that his voice still had value, even while much of his life remained unstable. Recovery was not a sudden transformation into a different man. He still had to rebuild trust. He had to rebuild his career. He had to walk into studios where people remembered the missed opportunities as clearly as they remembered the voice. But he stayed sober. In November 2025, Glenn marked 28 years without drugs or alcohol. He called himself one of the fortunate ones and directed his message toward people who were still suffering. That history changes the way his present decision looks. For decades, Glenn's story was about refusing to stop. He survived addiction, returned to recording, and kept going back on the road. Black Country Communion followed. So did the Dead Daisies. Solo records and tours built around the Deep Purple catalog. Movement became evidence that he had made it through. Now the responsible choice is the opposite. He is stopping because his doctors told him to stop. There is something especially difficult about that for a man who spent so many years proving he could return. In the past, the danger came partly from decisions he could eventually change. This time, medical tests have placed a limit in front of him that determination alone cannot remove. And Glenn already knows what it means to wake after heart surgery and begin again. The first time, he returned to the stage. This time, even he is not promising that he will. 3 days after Glenn Hughes walked off a stage in California, the words appeared online. Live shows canceled. There was no long introduction, no attempt to soften the announcement with promises he could not make. Glenn said that, following his doctor's advice, he would undergo heart surgery and retire from touring and live performance. Then he explained the decision in language that sounded unusually final. I really have no option and no choice. For a man who had spent much of his life finding a way back, that sentence carried more weight than a routine tour cancellation. Glenn had returned after Deep Purple fell apart. He had returned after years of addiction. He had returned after his first major heart operation. Even in January 2026, when an entire American tour was canceled, the message still looked toward the future. He hoped to meet the fans again on what he called the road of happy destiny. By August, he was no longer promising a road. The official announcement said Glenn had experienced several health issues during the previous year. MRIs, CT scans, and an echocardiogram had led his medical team to recommend another heart operation. The exact diagnosis has not been disclosed publicly, and no confirmed date or hospital has been announced. What Glenn chose to share was the consequence. His health now had to come before every remaining performance. That included an October 2nd concert at the Canyon Club in Agoura Hills, California. The show had been announced only weeks earlier after the enthusiastic response to Glenn's May reunion with members of the Dead Daisies. Tickets were being sold. The promotional material promised songs from both the Dead Daisies and Deep Purple. It looked like proof that, despite the canceled spring tour, Glenn still intended to perform when circumstances allowed. Now that date is gone too. Early reports identified the May 30th concert at the Arcada Theater in Illinois as his final performance. More recent coverage points to his appearance with Kings of Chaos in California on August 1st, only days before the announcement. The public record may become clearer, but the larger point remains unchanged. The people in the audience did not arrive expecting a farewell. There was no final tour banner, no carefully prepared goodbye speech, no moment when Glenn asked the audience to remember the night. He performed, left the stage, and then received, or finally accepted, medical advice that changed what came next. That is often how endings happen in real life. They do not always announce themselves while we are living through them. Glenn's statement did include gratitude. He described his life as one filled with the gift of music and thanked the people who had walked beside him through more than 5 decades. He did not sound bitter, but gratitude and disappointment can exist in the same message. He had survived enough to know that ignoring doctors would not be bravery. At 74, weeks away from his 75th birthday, Glenn was being asked to protect the life he had once nearly lost through addiction and later fought to rebuild after open-heart surgery. Continuing to tour might have looked courageous from the audience. Stopping was probably the harder decision. There is still an important distinction. Glenn has retired from touring and live performance. He has not announced his retirement from music itself. He may still write, record, or communicate with listeners in other ways. For the foreseeable future leaves some room, although it offers no timetable and no guarantee. Perhaps that is the honest place to leave the story. Not with a funeral disguised as a health update, not with a promise that determination will bring him back, and not with the certainty that the last song has already been sung. For now, the stage is quiet because Glenn Hughes decided to listen to his doctor. Whether it stays quiet forever is something even he cannot yet tell us. And for those who saw him perform in Illinois or California this year, one question may remain for a very long time. Did you realize, as Glenn walked away, that you might have just watched the voice of rock leave the stage for the final time? Tell us the first Glenn Hughes song you remember hearing, and where you were when that voice first stopped you in your tracks. And subscribe for more carefully researched stories about the artists who shaped an era.